This is Michael Govier from the Is It Safe podcast, and you are now clear for communication with Pop Goes Your World.
If you haven't already, subscribe on iTunes. And while you're there, please leave us a rating and review.
And now it's time for our featured presentation.
I'm Chris McBrien, and the pop culture from Generation X is everything to me.
And I'm Derek Myers, and I'm here to educate Chris on the great pop culture of today's generation.
Episode 191, Movies Based on Real Life. Chris McBrien along with Derek Myers, and this is Pop Goes Your World, the pop culture podcast for the generations. Now, this week we're going to be taking a look at some of our personal favorite movies that are based on real life. But before we get to that, Derek, you always seem to have some spare time on your hands. So what's new in the world of pop culture for you, my friend?
Hey, Chris, I wouldn't say this is a typical week. I actually did not have a lot of spare time on my hands. One of my colleagues at work is getting married this weekend, so she's been off all week. So we've had to cover, as you would with any colleague, when they're away, you cover while they're on vacation. And so we've been making do with the best we can while we're covering for our friend while she's off getting married. So congratulations, Sam, if you're listening. And it's been a pretty crazy week, but I still managed to get a few movies in there. And let me tell you, these are two crazy, out of left field, eclectic kind of picks that you would never guess in a million years. So I'll just jump in real quick. I don't know if you've seen either of these. So the first one is, I'll say newish. It came out in 2011. It's called Bridesmaids. Have you seen Bridesmaids?
Yes. My wife did subject me to that movie, believe it or not.
Okay. So Bridesmaids, it's the project by Kristen Wiig. It's got a lot of her compatriots from Saturday Night Live. Someone had talked to me about it not too long ago, so it was on my rewatch list, and I thought this is a perfect chance. I rewatched it. I enjoyed it, but it's one of these movies that I remembered enjoying it more than I actually did when I watched it the second time around. And I find often it's the other way around, where you sort of think, the movie was just okay, and then you rewatch it, and you're like, wow, that's a lot better than I expected. Unfortunately, with this one, for me, it was the other way around. I remembered it being, like, fantastic. And then I watched it, I'm like, yeah, it was just okay. And maybe it's because it's a comedy. And as we've said before, sometimes with a comedy, once you know the jokes, they're maybe not as funny. But I don't know. It was good. And I would certainly recommend it to people who haven't seen it, or maybe people like me who hadn't seen it in a long time.
I think it's more, as I always say, that these millennial films are just not rewatchable like Gen X movies are.
I mean, for me, I think part of it is that this is a movie written by women, starring women, that speaks to a lot of things, like to a female audience. And I think that there's some of the things in this movie that I don't find funny just because they're not intended to make me laugh. And whereas I know, like, my wife's seen this movie a few times and she loves it and she dies laughing every time. So anyway, it was good. Don't get me wrong. It's a strong movie, and I definitely recommend it if you haven't seen it. Then the other one, this going way back to 1986, right in your wheelhouse.
Yes. Oh, this is better.
Arnold Schwarzenegger classic. And I hope you can hear my air quotes when I say classic, because it's not. Raw Deal.
Jeez.
When was the last time you saw Raw Deal with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Never. That's the one with, isn't it with like Jim Belushi or something?
Nope, that's Red Heat.
Oh, that's Red Heat. Okay.
Yep.
So
this one was
Raw Deal.
This is like if you said to someone, talk to me about movies that Arnold Schwarzenegger did in the 80s. You'd be like, law enforcement guy who single-handedly takes on bad guys with a lot of fighting, shoot 'em ups, and car chases. Like, yeah, that's it. That's the movie. That's exactly what the movie was about. And I mean, I knew that's what the movie was going to be about I didn't know it, but I figured that's what the movie was going to be about. I don't honestly remember seeing this in the 80s, but I'm sure I did because, I was a 10-year-old boy in the 80s, so Arnold Schwarzenegger movies were the best. Yeah, it was exactly as bad as you'd expect, but it was kind of fun because I didn't know what was coming up. Like, I knew Arnold Schwarzenegger would be shooting up bad guys and blowing things up and doing car chases and giving bad dialogue and cheesy one-liners. And it was almost like a high school version of a play that will get better when you see these performers doing it in college. And it was like, this was like the Arnold intro to acting class. It's like the acting was pretty bad, but you could see promise of what he would become in some of the other films. And definitely his movements look quite like robotic. So you could sort of watch him and go, yeah, I can see why they cast him as the Terminator. Yeah, he looks like a walking robot. But it was fun. I laughed at things you probably shouldn't have laughed at, but it was a fun ride. Again, a very different movie than Bridesmaids, but those were the two that I watched this week.
Interesting. So I have a phenomenon that I just want to share with you. And I'm sure you know this. I'm sure listeners know this. But there is a tendency for TV shows to, how can I say this? To evolve over time. Usually, if you go back and watch the first episode of a TV series, and then you watch maybe into the second or third season, it looks like a different show. Like, for example, Seinfeld. If you watch the first episode of Seinfeld, it's unrecognizable. They look different. The restaurant is different. George is basically doing a second-rate Woody Allen impression. The show's different, And I told you recently that my sons really started liking watching Happy Days. They got into my DVD collection and we're watching season 5. And I'm like, Daddy, I really love Happy Days. I'm like, let me tell you, season 1 of Happy Days is not what you think. And they're like, what do you mean? So, Derek, there's a local station out of Hamilton, Ontario, that plays old TV shows during the day. Luck would have it, they were playing an episode of Happy Days from season 1. So I recorded it, on the PVR, and I put it on for the kids, and they were like, "Oh my God, what is this?" Because if you go back and watch season 1 of Happy Days, it's a totally different show. It's got a different.
There's no laugh
theme.
track, right?
There's no laugh track. They might use it once in a while. It's there's a different theme song. It's shot on film.
Yeah. Rock around the clock, right?
Yeah. Fonzie might have one line in every episode. He's not even really in it. And it's basically a TV version of American Graffiti. It even has Ron Howard in it. That's what it was meant to be, right?
Yeah.
So it didn't evolve into that 2-camera sitcom until later. And so the reason I bring this up is because I mentioned also that my son started to like WKRP in Cincinnati. And so he's been watching this. That might be one of the few shows in the history of television that was as good or better at the first episode as it was at the last episode. The show is unchanged because I sat down with him and we watched the first episode, as I mentioned, and it was fantastic. And then you watch it like a couple episodes in, you watch season 2. It's the exact same show. It didn't change at all. Like everything was there right from the get-go. And that's such a rare thing. I don't know. So I think WKRP is one of those rare TV shows that was just great right from the beginning. It was what it was. It had already found its stride. It didn't take time to develop, and it hit the ground running. So it's just something I wanted to mention. The other thing, I had a birthday recently.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Happy birthday, Chris. I totally forgot. I'm sorry.
Stop. I don't need to turn that off. Turn that stupid thing. I don't need it. It's not the reason I brought it up.
We didn't get you a cake because with all those candles, it would burn down your house, your neighbor's house, and all the houses in your community because you're so old.
I am.
But we love you.
So I wanted to mention because I received a really, really nice gift. This good friend of mine who will go unnamed got me this old comic book from 1982, which was the movie adaptation of Time Bandits. And I just thought it was such a great gift. But the reason that I also bring this up is because my family, I got let down this year. I got let down. I didn't get what I wanted for my birthday this year. Any guess what I wanted for my birthday this year?
Well, I know for Christmas you always want this, so I got to think your birthday you want it too. Was it a neck full of gold?
It was a neck full of gold. That's all I wanted. Neck full of gold, and I didn't get it. So I'm a little disappointed. Hopefully they'll come through at Christmas time, I'm hoping. But not only do I get gifts for my birthday, I also give them. So I'm going to give you one right now.
Here's your dad joke of the week.
Derek, why didn't the man cook alligator for dinner?
Oh, jeez. I don't know, because he was a terrible cook.
He only had a crock pot. It was a crock pot, Derek.
Yeah.
It was a crock pot.
Oh,
jeez.
Yeah. That was bad, but I got to admit, I kind of chuckled at.
Oh, yes.
Happy pandemic pandemic-versary.
Don't be ridiculous.
Okay, well then, have I got a show for you?
Oh yeah, because I watch that show so much.
I can't wait for you.
Oh, that's right up your alley.
30 bags of potato chips and 12 bottles of liquor.
So this looks like something that would be up my alley.
I'm doing crappy. How you doing? You're like, I'm doing crappy too.
I want it to end. I want them all to go to jail.
Boo. We need to lock you up for telling that joke.
I think that would be best. All right, so this week we're doing a topic, and we decided it would be interesting to take a look at movies that are based on real life. So we each put together a top 5 list of our favorite movies based on real life. Now, I should point out, this isn't just strictly biographies, you know, and which in fact, if you think about it, we should actually maybe come back and do that on a future episode, you know, like our favorite biographical movies. But instead, what we're doing is we're going to look at movies based on real life, you know, so that it could be a biography, or it could be a movie based on, you know, an event or series of events, or, you know, sometimes you just see in movies where it says based on a true story, you know, kind of like that. So does that make sense, Derek? Am I just rambling here?
Yeah. So we've had this conversation probably more off camera than actually on the mic, but about doing this as a topic or some variation of this. And so when we decided earlier this week that this was our topic, I got to thinking, and I did a little bit of homework, and the depth of movies that have been based off of real life events or real people is incredible. And I realized that, you know, they always say truth is stranger than fiction. And a lot of times something will happen and people say, oh, you know, if you read about that, you would never believe it if you hadn't seen it really happen in front of you. And those are often the kind of things that get turned into movies. And so as I was doing a little bit of homework and digging through the various internet archives and putting together a list of movies based on real events or inspired by true events or based on the life of a real person, it got to be a really long list very, very quickly. And I realized that a lot of these movies could essentially be categorized into a handful of different groupings. And I found that once I sort of wrapped my head around that and then looked at the movies that way, it became a little easier to narrow down my list, but it was still challenging. So bear with me on this one. What I did was I found there's sort of a handful of topics. You have movies based on real life that are based on actual historical events, things that really happened. And it's not so much any one individual as much as a series of events or a group of people that came together for a reason. So like, again, and I've got a lot of examples I'm just going to throw out. I'm trying not to spoil at least the movies that I picked. I have no idea what's on your list, but these are things like and often these wouldn't be movies like about things like World War. So you have things like Black Hawk Down or Munich, or the Trial of the Chicago 7 came out a couple years ago. Like, these are historical events that feature large casts of people. And in many cases, these are movies where either something historically significant has happened, and that's why we're telling the story, or maybe the story is not as well known or wasn't as well known at the time, but we, for whatever reason, have decided we need to shine a spotlight on this. So like maybe something like Zero Dark 30, which was all about the military intelligence unit that found and located Osama bin Laden post 9/11. Like, the movie takes place over a decade and features a lot of characters, but it's something that they felt they wanted to tell a story about. So that was sort of the one category, was like what I called the historical event. Then there were the movies that, like, they're basically biographies. These are movies about, they're focused primarily on one or two people that are real people that had an important role in history. Again, it's maybe someone who we know and love and just want to, glamorize on the big screen. Maybe it's someone who didn't get the due that they maybe deserved at the time, but they're important to history, so we want to know a little more about them. Or, often this will be like, like political figures, monarchs, politicians, musicians, and performers are often fall in this category. So again, a bunch of movies that fall on the list are things like Gandhi or Amadeus or Lincoln or The Aviator, or more recently you have something like Dolomite Is My Name, things like this, where it's like one or two main characters, and the movie tends to be prominently about their life. Sometimes it's their whole life, and sometimes it's just an important part of their life. So anyway, I got a little more to go on this, but I just want, are you on board with me? Like, does this make sense that we've sort of got these categories?
Yeah,
okay.
I guess so.
So then another category we have is the sports movie or the underdog movie. And nobody does this better than Disney. You look up Disney's movie catalog, you type Disney movies based on true events, and you're going to get like 20 or 30 lists, a list 20 or 30 movies long. And they're not all Disney, but some of the best ones are
like
Disney.
Miracle.
So I was going to say Miracle was the first one on my list. Or they have like Remember the Titans or The Greatest Game Ever Played. The Rookie is it's a great one that I love because I'm getting a little older, so it's always nice to see a movie about an old guy who can still throw the ball 90 miles an hour. But like we've done a couple of these.
Because you were always good at doing that.
Yeah, no kidding. But like a movie like Moneyball that we did not too long ago, or Raging Bull. Like these, again, they're movies about an underdog or a sports movie, or you're someone you maybe don't think is going to do as well. You have movies like The Blind Side. Again, it's that sort of cheer for the underdog kind of film. Some of them are more feel good than others, but there's a ton of them. Then the last category, two categories. Then there's the one this is again like sort of the biography, but it's more like I've called it the unknown hero. So it's a story about somebody who, until the movie came out, most people had no idea who they were, but they did something that was culturally relevant or spectacularly heroic or survived some sort of a trauma, or again, it's this idea that they did something that people wouldn't believe if you hadn't seen it in a movie. So you had things like the movie Captain Phillips, for example, with Tom Hanks, or Aaron Brockovich, or Hotel Rwanda. Like you have these things that are, where there's an individual who has done something that has changed the lives of other people or has done something incredibly heroic. The movie 127 Hours, where the guy has to cut off his own arm. Or Straight Outta Compton. It's like, here's a movie, again, it's a, you could call it a documentary, or not a documentary, like a biopic, where it's about these people. But in some cases it's like, well, I didn't know a lot about them until I saw this movie. The Imitation Game's a good example of this, where it's about Turing, the guy who did the Enigma machines during the war. Again, not a lot known about him publicly, and then more recently they wanted to, when they made the movie, they focused on different parts of his life and more of the after the war stuff, because he suffered tremendous persecution because he was gay. So again, there's these movies that are called sort of the unknown hero or the lesser known heroes. And then the last category I sort of had was these movies that are made about like a social issue or social relevance. Like the movie Spotlight, for example, which won the Oscar for Best Picture 4 or 5 years back, it was an important issue that they wanted to get out there. Or a movie like The Big Short was about the stock market crash or the mortgage crash, these kinds of movies. So once I sort of realized there's like a handful of these categories, there's a lot of movies you can jam into these categories. And I found that really helped me sort of narrow my list. So anyway, I've been talking for a long time.
I love you, man. But let me tell you, you overthink everything. Like, it's so funny. So let's just get into a list. And we'll start at number 5 and work our way up to number 1. Just movies based on real life. We'll just keep it simple. All right. I love all these categories that you've put together, but I mean, why just cram them all together and put them out there? So why don't you start us off? Your number 5 movie based on real life. What do you got and why?
Sure. So before I get to that, I want to just say I tried to pick movies from my 1 to 5 that sort of fit in all the different categories, because I thought that was that was my best way. So my first one is one of these sports movies, this underdog movies, again, done by Disney from 1993, Cool Runnings. So this is the movie about the Jamaican sprinters that didn't qualify for the Olympics,
team, right?
So they decided to go to the Winter Olympics 2 years later and compete in the bobsled team, because they got it in their mind that part of the reason the bobsledders do very well is that they have to push they literally have to run and sprint and push the bobsled at the start of the race. And if you can get a bunch of sprinters doing that, they're going to get that few second advantage right off the bat. And then all they got to do is learn to do the bobsled, which, again, one of the things that Disney does well with these kinds of movies is they play kind of fast and loose with reality in order to tell a good story.
Sure. And
I think one of the things that this movie maybe glosses over is just how difficult it is to actually be a bobsledder. But I mean, that aside,
especially being from Jamaica.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly part of the humor from the movie is the fact that these guys have never seen snow, and that the Winter Olympics are in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. When they get there, there's a snowstorm, and like they're freaking out because they've never seen snow before. But again, this is a feel-good movie. It's the underdog tale. It's these 4 Jamaican sprinters who thought they were going to go to the Olympics, and there was a little mishap that they show at the start of the movie where one of the guys trips and he knocks the other guys down and they don't qualify for the Olympics. And they, rather than give up their dream of being Olympic athletes, they decide let's try something a little different here. And then you've got the late great John Candy in the role as the coach, who has a connection to, I think, the father of one of the sprinters. And John Candy's character is a previous Olympic coach. So, the movie goes from there where he takes these guys under his wing and teaches them. And like any other Disney movie, there's the lessons that are learned along the way and the stories of redemption and all that stuff. And of course, at the end of the movie, and again, these movies are based on real life, so I'm gonna have to spoil all of them. So if you haven't seen them, I'm sorry, but like they're based on real life. So these guys, the first year out, they did not win a gold medal, but it becomes more a movie like the first Rocky, where it's like Rocky doesn't win at the end of the first Rocky, he just goes the distance. And that's really the lesson that comes out of Cool Runnings is, if you're dedicated and you work hard and you try it, even though you don't win, you still get a tremendous sense of satisfaction of doing the best you can under the circumstances. So, I love this movie. I haven't seen it in a while, but I'm definitely looking forward to a rewatch in the not too distant futures. Cool Runnings, my number 5 pick.
And that was a thing back in the '88 Olympics, the Winter Olympics that year. The Jamaican bobsled team. I remember it was a cultural phenomenon. So yeah, I remember that. Okay, Derek, if I told you that my first movie was a 1980 film that was produced by Mel Brooks, what would your guess be to what this movie might be?
Wow. Based on a real thing?
Yeah.
I didn't know that Mel Brooks had his fingers in the pie of any sort of real life movies. So
it's The Elephant Man.
Oh, I didn't. As soon as you said that, I'm like, yep, that's right.
Now, Mel Brooks, of all people, produced this film. It's based on the life of Joseph Merrick. Now, in the movie, they call him John Merrick. Right. But he was this grossly disfigured man that lived during the 1800s in London, England. And he was in this freak show, and he was treated like an animal. And people would come, and they would pay just to look at him. And then a doctor, played by Sir Anthony Hopkins, has to treat him one night at the hospital because the circus handlers would beat him so bad. And man, just thinking about this movie is painful. And it's not just about human cruelty. The movie is also about dignity, and the human spirit. They introduced this man to the Bible and reading Shakespeare, and he goes to the opera, and then he comes to know kindness and friendship. And this movie is haunting. Like it's shot in black and white. It's just mesmerizing, and it's painful to watch, but it's extremely moving. It only cost $5 million to make. It was a commercial success because it made, almost $30 million domestically. It was a big critical success. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. And then the makeup that they used to transform John Hurt. Yeah, the guy from Alien. We remember they had the alien coming out of his stomach. So he plays John Merrick. The makeup was so good in this movie that the Oscars the next year realized they had to add a new category. Best makeup, because they felt like this movie was so good, like they owed it something, even so the next year they're like, we need to create this new category. They were inspired by it, right? I think we need to review this movie at some point on a future podcast, but I mean, for now, it's one of the greatest films in my mind ever made about real life events. So Elephant Man's my number 5. What do you got for number 4?
Yeah, no, that's a good pick. I actually had to watch The Elephant Man, and the very first time I ever saw it was when I was in university studying film. Oh, nice. It was one of the movies that was on the syllabus the first year. I remember a lot of the movies were like these foreign films or these art films, and it's like I never heard any of these. And then you get sort of to the newer ones at the end of the list. I'm like, Elephant Man, that sounds familiar. And yeah, like you said, it was great. I didn't really know what to expect, but no, it was fantastic.
I saw this movie in the theater when I was 10 years old. I went and saw it, and I was just shocked at what I watched, and I was just mesmerized by it. And it really moved me, as a kid, and it's just kind of stuck with me ever since. So that's why it's on there. All right.
Yep. All right. So my number 4 pick, this is one of those ones that's based on historical events.
Okay.
And this is the 1995 film Apollo 13.
Oh, nice. Nice. So good one.
I love space and NASA and anything to do with the Apollo missions. Like I'm a junkie for that stuff. I love documentaries about like the flights to the moon and all. Like I'm all in. And around the time this movie came out, I can't remember if it was just before or just after, probably just after, HBO did a documentary series called From the Earth to the Moon. And I think it was produced by Hanks and Ron Howard, based on their relationship they made during this. But yeah, anyway, that's just a side thing. So Apollo 13, obviously real life event. It's when the astronauts Lovell, Hayes, and Swaggart were in the Apollo 13 capsule going to the moon, and then there was a technical problem, and then, you know, the famous line, Houston, we have a problem, and they realized they could die out there. Like, they weren't going to the moon anymore. They were just desperate to get home. And so eventually, of course, again, spoiler, they make it home. Now, this movie was a critical success, and it made a lot of money. It was directed by Ron Howard. It starred Tom Hanks, Bill Paxton, and Kevin Bacon as the main three astronauts on board the capsule. Had Gary Sinise in a supporting role as well. And oh my God, I can't think of the guy's name. It was the flight director. I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. He was nominated for 9 Oscars.
Was it Ed Harris?
Ed Harris, that's the guy. Thank you. Nominated for 9 Oscars, including Best Picture. It ended up winning two Oscars for sound and film editing, but well deserved. It was like a fan favorite. One of the stories I think I've told on the podcast before was with this movie, with any movie that's based on real events, sometimes it's hard to get people excited about a movie where they know the ending, or that they think they know the ending. And when I used to work at Blockbuster Video, this was a very popular video rental choice. And I can remember on numerous occasions, my good friend Greg, who was a friend of the podcast, he worked with me at Blockbuster. And when people would come in and they'd be like, oh, Apollo 13, that's the one with the astronauts. He's like, no. And he'd like quiet his voice and lean in a little bit. And he goes, they change the ending and they all die at the end, but it's a surprise. And then he's like, and the people would be like, really? And he's like, yeah. He's like, and this was pre-internet, right? So people couldn't just go online and check. He's like, yeah, it's like the best kept secret. That's why the movie's doing so well, is people are going back to see it when they realize the ending's been changed and all the astronauts die. And they're like, oh, wow, I had no idea. And so we would always get people renting the movie. And so they'd go home and watch it and fully expect, because Greg told them that the astronauts die at the end, they were expecting them to die at the end. And then when they don't, they enjoy the movie even more. But that's what happened in real life. They lived. And so, of course, they come back and they're like, hey, you tricked me. And he'd be like, yeah, but didn't you enjoy the movie more thinking they were going to die? And then when they didn't you enjoy the ending even more? And they're like, you know what? Yeah, we kind of did. So that's the thing. That's always the trick with a movie based on real events, is depending on how well known the events were, sometimes the movie really loses its steam. And you know, it's
Could you imagine if Greg pulled that trick with a different movie? Like, for example, let me just, I'm spitballing here. So let's say somebody comes in and they're like, hey, I want to rent The Sixth Sense. And Greg's like, hey, guess what? Bruce Willis isn't really a ghost, and he doesn't die at the beginning. He's alive through the whole thing. Enjoy. Like, what if he pulled that?
Well, it is what it is.
Yeah,
but in any case, so this one, it's when it came out, it was a big deal because of a lot of the special effects work. It was a big deal because they shot the scenes with the astronauts in space in actual zero G. They used what they call the vomit comet, where the plane goes like there's a big plane NASA uses to train their astronauts, where it goes sharply up and then sharply down, and you get like 2 or 3 minutes of weightlessness. And so they did hours and hours and hours and hours of this weightlessness to get these shots done. And so it just gives the movie that extra authenticity. Now, in today's, you're making a movie like this today, you do it all with the computer. It would be way cheaper and certainly easier on your actors. But at the time, this was the practical effect that was just easier to do than try to figure out another way in order to make it look realistic. Now, there was some fantastic computer animation done for things like the sequences where the spaceships are taking off. But this was a good combination in 1995 of real practical effects and digital computer generated effects. And I think it was a good milestone. As we've talked before, like, we did The Last Starfighter last week, and we said, like, some of it doesn't hold up. It doesn't look that great. It's really low budget. And, well, I mean, by today's standard, it looks cheesy. But you got to start somewhere. This was like a good example of a significant milestone along the way in computer animation. So nice. Apollo 13 is my number 4 pick.
All right, it's a good one. Okay, my number 4, Derek, you're going to hate it. You're going to hate my number 4 pick. I'm going back to the well again. I'm going back to another black and white film from 1980, and that's Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull. We reviewed this movie together back on episode 163. Derek, I know you hated this movie, but you got to be honest. I mean, as far as filmmaking goes, this is a masterpiece. And Scorsese has obviously done some legendary work, in his time as a director, but he's never been better. In my mind, he's never been better than he was here with Raging Bull. And the movie centers around the life of boxer Jake LaMotta. But what it really is it's an exploration of masculinity and rage and jealousy and misogyny. It's like the Elephant Man. It's not an easy film to watch. It's not a quote unquote likable, or entertaining film. But that doesn't take away how important it is as a piece of art. Both, like I say, this movie and The Elephant Man, they both feel like a punch in the gut. But they're important films, and they're both about the underbelly of humanity, I think. And those are not things that, people always want to talk about, right? But they exist. They're a part of real life. And if you're going to make a movie about real life, then you can't ignore the bad and only focus on the good, because unfortunately, in real life, there's a lot of bad. And art, I think real art should imitate life. And in Raging Bull, Scorsese does that. So it's my number 4.
Well, so you said, so what you said about my take of this is correct. I do not care for this movie. I do not like this movie. I can respect it as artistic. I would certainly not put it in my list, and I certainly didn't put it in my list. And honestly, we've done a handful of like movies based on real life on the podcast, so I deliberately tried to not retread on some of those, mainly because most of them were movies you had picked, which maybe I didn't like all that much anyway. But you had said you felt Scorsese's never been better than he was in this, and I got to disagree with you on that one. But again, I think we've already had that discussion.
Maybe Taxi Driver. Maybe Taxi Driver, but that's it.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll revisit that at another time.
We'll come back to that one. Okay, so number 3.
Okay, so as I previously mentioned with Apollo 13,
yes,
I love everything and anything to do with NASA and the space program, and it just so turns out this next one's on a sort of similar vein. This is one of those ones that falls into that sort of unknown hero category. It's a story about people who maybe at the time didn't get the recognition and the due that they deserved, but we're at a point in history now where today's generation is looking back and saying, like, who do we really need to shine a spotlight on because they did something amazing, and let's make a movie about it. And that's what I'm doing for my number 3 pick. It's a film called Hidden Figures from 2016.
I've heard this is fantastic. You got to nominate this on the podcast because I want to watch it. It looks good.
Yeah. So for those who maybe are not this is only a few years old, but for those who are not as familiar, the synopsis here is it's the story of a team of female African-American mathematicians who served a vital role in NASA during the early years of the U.S. space program. It stars Taraji P. Henson, Octavia Spencer, and Janelle Monáe. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And then Kevin Costner in a supporting role. And it was nominated for 3 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Actress in Supporting Role, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It unfortunately did not win any of those, but I believe the year it was nominated, it was up against some pretty heavy competition. But this movie is one of those movies where here are 3 women of color who in the 1960s were experts in their field in science, technology, mathematics, and were totally taken for granted. Were not given opportunities. I don't even want to say given. They worked as hard as they could to try and make opportunities for themselves that were not otherwise available, and faced tremendous hardship. And it took 50 years for us to make a movie where, everybody and their mother now has a pretty good idea of who they were and their contributions. And you see this story of these 3 women struggling despite the fact that they are brilliant and the top of their field and doing a way better job than the white dudes in this story, which I'm sure was the case in real life. And in a time where women, and especially women of color, are encouraged to go into STEM, into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, this is a great movie that shows that, you even with perseverance and by pushing through and doing the best you can do despite all obstacles, and just focusing on the work and doing what you can, that you can make a difference. And it's crappy that these 3 women in real life didn't get anywhere near the recognition they deserved, maybe until much, much later in their life. But, it's certainly an inspiring tale for anyone who's looking to go into technology, especially for women and people of color. So I think this is I loved it. I thought this movie was great. And that's why I made my list. Number 3, Hidden Figures.
Nice. Okay, we're getting into some of the good ones now. I'm going with Titanic. I remember when this movie came out back in December of 1997, it had all these stories swirling around about this movie. Like the film had gone over budget and it was a big mess as a production. And it was going to be the biggest box office bomb of all time. I mean, you know what's going to happen, right? The ship sinks. Spoiler alert. You know, half the movie is about the ship sinking. The Titanic starts going down like halfway through the movie, right? But the thing is, love it or hate it, this is a really, really well-made film. And instead of becoming this major box office bomb, it became the highest grossing film of all time. You know, and that lasted, you know, right through until they started making all these CGI crappy movies and charging everyone more money for the 3D and all that stuff. And I'm not bitter in any way. But the thing is, Titanic shouldn't work, but it does. And the performances in it are great. Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio basically went on to become 2 of the greatest actors of their generation. James Cameron is one of the most successful filmmakers of all time. And you could argue all 3 of them were at their peak, you know, as artists with this movie. It's probably the best work, I think, that any of them have done. It's an amazing film. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but I mean, like, this movie's been talked to death over the years. So I'm just going to say, as far as movies based on real life go, number 3 on my list.
So I think, okay, so let me start by saying I love Titanic. I think it's a great film. And I think most people have to admit that it's great. Now, it's clearly, a love story wrapped around the disaster of the ship sinking, and it's a special effects masterpiece. And Cameron certainly knows how to tell a good story, and he knows how to create a good movie. So, I mean, we're not arguing any of that stuff. But I think this is one of those ones where you sort of have to put the quotes around it and say, like, inspired by true events, because aside from the fact that the ship sank, a lot of this is just speculation, as I mean any sort of historical piece would have to be. But with something like this, it's like, yeah, they may have had a passenger manifest and they created characters that had names similar to the people who were actually on the ship. But I guess the older the movie, the older the subject matter you're making your movie about, I think the less accurate it's got to be, right? Like the more liberties the filmmakers have to take in order to make an interesting story. So honestly, this one never even crossed my mind as being in this category. Yes, the Titanic was a real ship. Yes, the Titanic really sank, but I would never, like, I made a list of over 100 films. Titanic's not on the list. And even when you just said it, I didn't think to myself, damn it, how did I overlook that? Like, to me, this is just one that, for whatever reason, I don't really feel falls into this category as accurately. It does. It does.
You're also a guy that broke this down into like 5 different categories and all this. But here's the thing. Cameron was meticulous about including details in this film that were as accurate as possible, right? So I mean, there's real life people in it, like whether it's the captain of the ship or whatever. Even though the one scene that he shoots on the deck was actually based on a photograph. Like, I don't know. I think movie based on real life, the Titanic, it happened, and so I mean, are they, fictional characters? Sure, right? But I mean, it is based on real life.
Yeah, and I mean, like one of the other movies I mentioned earlier was like Braveheart. Again, I've done a little bit of homework on that, and I know that huge portions of that movie are completely fictional or guessed. Like, hey, we think this might have happened, but to tell a good story and make a good movie, you've got to have some artistry in there. So again, I don't fault it. I love the movie, but to me, this one just is one of those ones that I think there's too much of it that I know or suspect is made up for the artistry of the movie, that for me, it doesn't fall into the category as nicely as
I get what you're saying, because I mean, if you think of something like Saving Private Ryan, it's about World War II, but they're all fictional characters, right? So I get where you're coming from, but
okay. Anyway, it's a small
one.
Criticism on what's otherwise a fantastic film.
Yes. Okay, number 2. What do you got, my friend?
Yeah, my last 2 are like super heavyweights. These 2 are 2 of my all-time favorite movies. They both make my top 20 list without any question. And
will there be crossover with my list?
It was a struggle for me which one of these was going to be number 1 and number 2, but ultimately, I if I could make them a 1A and a 1B, I would, but we gotta stick to the 1 and 2. So for my number 2, this one falls. My number 2 pick is The Social Network from 2010.
Nice.
This is the story about Mark Zuckerberg, the creator of Facebook, and how he and some of his friends created Facebook, and how some of those friends got hugely screwed over. It's directed by one of my all-time favorite directors, David Fincher. It's written by the great Aaron Sorkin, whose work I enjoy immensely. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. It won 3 of them, including Best Screenplay, Best Film Editing, and Best Music. And that was Trent Reznor, better known as the guy from Nine Inch Nails, won an Oscar for the music on this one. But it was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Cinematography, and Sound Mixing. Like, this was a big heavyweight movie in 2010. And I've been following this movie a lot since then. It has got a tremendous amount of praise. A lot of people, if you look online for like best movies of the 2010s, this is usually in the top 3 of just about everybody's list. I would categorize this, going back to my original categories, as sort of it falls into a couple of them, but more of like a social relevance, social issues category, because I think it's important. It's an important film for a lot of reasons, but for me, one of the reasons I think it's an important film is just it really hits the nail on the head, and it talks about the emergence of social media and how, it's almost like it's prophetic of seeing into the future of just how important and how big a deal social media is going to become. And it does this great job of sort of documenting the process of how these guys, were in the right place, the right time, had the right idea, and just boom, it took off from there. This is definitely a movie we will be doing on this podcast in the not too distant future. I love this film. My number 2 pick, movie based on real life, Social Network.
Like it. All right. Okay, my number 2. I'm going back a few years before that. Go figure. That's what I do. I'm going back to 1976, All the President's Men. So I mentioned with Titanic that movie shouldn't have worked, mainly because we know what's going to happen. And with All the President's Men, we know that the work done by Woodward and Bernstein are going to help bring down a presidency. We know Richard Nixon resigns. But that doesn't take away from the suspense in this movie, not a single bit. And for me, that takes some pretty masterful filmmaking to pull that kind of stuff off. And that's exactly what this is. It's masterful filmmaking. So, if you think about what could be a really boring look at investigative reporting around, this 2-bit burglary attempt, as they mention, in the movie, it ends up being this massive sort of puzzle-solving exercise. And it's thrilling, it's engaging every step of the way. The lead actors, Redford and Hoffman, they're both amazing as Woodward and Bernstein. They play really, really well off each other. It's obviously based on a book of the same name by Woodward and Bernstein that came out in 1974. And it walks you through all the investigative reporting that they did and trying to find out just how high up the chain that, the cover-up went into Watergate. Turns out it went up pretty high. And I think this movie is just as relevant today as it was back in 76, especially given the way, certain American politicians have tried to, use their position of power for dirty tricks and digging up dirt and corrupt money. And as much as things change, some things just stay the same. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's all that's laid out in All the President's Men. I think it's a relevant film, right to this day. So my number 2.
That's a good pick. So before we jump into our number 1s, I want to just have a quick side chat with you.
Sure.
I want to talk about performers who have won or been nominated for an Oscar for playing a real life person. And
the Academy loves that.
They do.
They really do.
And I want to just get your take on it. Do you think that we get so many of these movies where it's based on the events of a real life person because they know it could potentially win awards? And do actors love these kinds of performances for that same reason? It's sort of a chicken and the egg question. Like, what do you think is driving so many of these kinds of movies?
I don't know. That's a good question. Unfortunately, I think Hollywood is driven more by money than it is by trying to win awards, and it only wants to win awards if it means more money. So
well, and
maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. I think that's it. And I mean, you get it. So one of the performers that came to mind when I was sort of thinking about this earlier was someone like Daniel Day-Lewis, arguably one of the best actors working today. He's been nominated for numerous Academy Awards for playing real life people. He was nominated for his role in My Left Foot. He was nominated for his role in The Name of the Father. He was nominated for his role in Lincoln. And in each of those cases, like, he's playing an actor he's playing a real person who's tremendously different. Like his performance in My Left Foot is for playing a character who is paralyzed, right? He only can literally move around like the one foot, hence the title of the book and or movie. So I think a lot of performers look for these kinds of roles because it's challenging, right? It's gonna really test their ability. And there's that whole scene in the movie Tropic Thunder, and we won't go into it because it's super not politically correct anymore, where they talk about, like, if you're playing a character with some sort of handicap or disability, it's almost a guarantee you will get a nomination, right, if not a win.
But you never go full.
But if you take it too far, then it's seen as like an insensitive
go home
parody.
empty-handed.
Yeah, exactly. And so, although in Tropic Thunder the dialogue is meant to be humorous, it actually is pretty accurate, which I think
that's why I'm laughing at it.
More
it's
funny.
so accurate. Yeah.
So anyway, I was just reminded of that earlier this week when I was doing my homework, and so many of the movies that I was putting on this list, it was like Oscar winner, Oscar nominee, Oscar winner, Oscar. It's like, holy cow! Like, there are, like I said, I got a list here of almost 100 movies. I would be shocked if less than 80% of them don't have an Oscar nomination for performance by somebody in each of these movies. Like, it seems to go hand in hand. So anyway,
just going back to Tropic Thunder for a second, that scene with Robert Downey Jr. when he's delivering that speech, if you were a writer and you wrote that scene, you wrote that speech, to watch that come to life must have been one of the most thrilling things of all time. Like, yeah. Just to watch the way he just breathes life into that scene. So funny. Oh my God. Anyway, okay, so number one.
It's funny because it's true. Okay.
Exactly. Your number one film.
My number one pick.
Based on real life. What is it?
Based on real life.
Yes.
Again, this is one of those ones that I'm going to sort of classify as the unknown hero. This is a guy who wrote a book based on his real life, and until he had, nobody knew who he was. And then once they read the book, they turned it into a movie. And this is the 1990 film from Martin Scorsese, Goodfellas. This is a book about Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta. It also stars Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, directed by Scorsese, as I already said. Was nominated for six Oscars. Joe Pesci won for Best Supporting Actor. It was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Writing, Best Film Editing. Like, this, arguably, a lot of people, this is their absolute all-time favorite movie, hands down, in any category. This definitely makes my all-time top 10, no question about it. This is probably also in my top 10 of movies I've seen the most in my entire life. I love this film. You had said earlier about Raging Bull that you thought it was, Scorsese's best work. I would argue all day long that I think Goodfellas is every bit as good as Raging Bull, maybe for different reasons, but this movie, there is so much to like about this movie, aside from the fact that it's about, villains. But I think that's part of what so many people like about a lot of movies is the idea that the bad guy can be glamorized in a way that you're like, oh, this looks like exciting. Look at this guy. He doesn't have a real job and he gets to do these bad things and get away with it. And then, of course, by the end, he doesn't get away with it. And so, the cycle is preserved and evil is punished and all that good stuff. But I just love the fact that this movie follows this story. It's this story of this nobody who becomes a somebody who just reaches too far and gets careless and gets greedy and becomes a victim of his own circumstance. And it's just all these bad guys who get their comeuppance by the end because they do bad things. And at the end of the day, bad people generally will get punished. And this movie, they certainly do. This is a great film. I love it for so many reasons. It is my number one. Like I said, it was between The Social Network and Goodfellas, and these flip-flopped all week long. But I ended up landing Goodfellas as my number one.
Nice. Okay, my number one. I've mentioned before that one of my favorite movies of all time is The Killing Fields from 1984. Me and Yancey reviewed it all the way back on episode 55, like 4 years ago. And it's my personal best movie ever made about real events. So if you've never seen it, it's the story of these two real-life journalists in Cambodia during the Vietnam War. There's Sidney Schomburg. He's from the New York Times. And his Cambodian associate, Dith Pran. And it's really about how the Vietnam War spills over into Cambodia and how the communist Khmer Rouge take power in the country. And then they basically conduct this purge of citizens so that they can assume total control over the country. And Dith Pran, he can't get out when they evacuate the country, and he's sent to this concentration camp where he witnesses what becomes known as the killing fields, where his fellow citizens are killed by the Khmer Rouge. And the most powerful thing about the movie is that you get totally engrossed in the story. And then at the very end of the film, they put up these pictures of the real Sydney and the real Dith Pran, and then it hits you like a ton of bricks that the horror that you just watched was real. Like, this actually happened to two real people, especially Dith Pran and what he had to go through and what he had to suffer. It makes me cry every time I watch this movie. It is one of the single most powerful films ever made, and it's the best film that I've ever seen that are based on real life events. So that's my number one. Probably no surprise to you. You know how much.
No, that's a strong pick. Yeah. And I may be incorrect here, but I think I might have actually been on that podcast with you and Yancey. I think I was.
I don't know.
Or if I was, I think we've talked about it since then, because I know you and I've talked about this movie many times. This is a great film.
Yeah.
For all the reasons you said, this is a strong pick. And I think, it's just as relevant today, because you look at what's happening in the Middle East right now as America is leaving. And I think, we're going to see these same kinds of, unfortunately, we're going to see these same kinds of atrocities where the people that have been left behind that could not leave the country for whatever reason are going to face, in many cases, death simply because they supported the Allies and the Americans who were there. And it's like, here's this movie, The Killing Fields, from what year did it come out?
84.
But it was based on the events in Vietnam, which was in the 70s. So
73.
Here's this movie that's showing these atrocities of how things, played out in the 70s. And here we are, almost 50 years later, and we're going to unfortunately probably see a lot of the same kind of things happening in a slightly different part of the world.
We saw basically the same thing happen in Rwanda. And like you said, now probably going to happen in Afghanistan. Like, it just keeps happening. But history repeats itself, and we never learn from it. But we can definitely watch a film like this and just appreciate, how important it is. So yeah.
And like you said, if you watch this movie and you don't cry at the end, you are heartless.
And I remember too, there was a lot of criticism. And again, we talked about this on the podcast, years ago when we did it. There was a lot of criticism about using Imagine by John Lennon at the end of the film.
Right.
Some people thought it was kind of hokey. I don't. It's my favorite song of all time. And its appearance at the end of the film is perfect because it really kind of ties in all those ideals. Like, what if the world, there was no religion? What if there was no politics and government? Then we could all just get along. And here you've got this guy from New York, this Jew from New York, who is a journalist over in Cambodia who befriends, this Cambodian self-proclaimed journalist and photographer. And together they're able to get the word out to the world about what's going on over there and overcome everything to still be friends. And that's why I love at the very end of the movie when Dith Pran says, "There's nothing to forgive."
Yeah.
There's nothing. And you're like, Dith, look what you've been through. Like, this is crazy. And nope, there's nothing to forgive. We're still friends. Such a good movie. God, I love it. Okay, time now for
Fun with Caveman.
All right, my friends. So we talked about movies based on real life events. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a movie title. Okay? All you have to do is mention the real life person that's depicted in the film.
Oh boy.
Okay. It's easy. I mean, most of these you've already mentioned tonight on the podcast. Okay. You're going to get. I want the prominent person here. So what I mean is, if I say Aaron Brockovich, I'm looking for what?
Aaron Brockovich.
Right. I don't want Aaron Brockovich's boss or her kids. I'm sure they're all wonderful people. They had a lot of influence on her story, but I'm looking for the main person. Okay.
Okay.
So that's the key. So I name the movie the main person, the main real person that's involved in the film. And some of these are super, super easy. Okay. Moneyball.
Billy Bean.
This one you've already mentioned, The Social Network.
Mark Zuckerberg.
All right. Gorillas in the Mist.
Ooh, I know that was Sigourney Weaver, and she was playing Diane Fossey.
Very good. All right. Walk the Line.
Oh, that was that was the singer, Johnny Cash.
You mentioned this one on the podcast already. The Aviator.
Howard Hughes.
You also mentioned this one on the podcast. The Imitation Game.
Turing. I can't think of his first name.
I'll give it to you. It's Alan Turing.
Alan Turing.
The Theory of Everything.
Oh, that was Eddie Redmayne. That was Stephen Hawking.
See, you're killing it. Okay. The Last King of Scotland.
Oh, it was Forrest Whitaker playing Idi Amin.
Milk.
His name was Harvey Milk.
Obviously, I needed the first name there. So you did the last name. All right. The Greatest Story Ever Told.
Isn't that about the Bible? Wow. I'm going to take a huge guess here and say Moses?
Oh, no, it was Jesus.
Oh.
Jesus Christ, Derek. The King's Speech.
Ooh, that was, it was Colin Firth, and it was Bertie. What the hell was his real name? He was, Albert was his real name. What was his friggin' king name? He was, I don't know.
It was King George VI.
George.
They're getting harder. They're getting harder.
Yeah,
and the
no
last
kidding.
one, The Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh, geez. Well, I know it was Leonardo DiCaprio, and he played. Wow. You know what? You give me all night. I'm not going to get it. I don't know.
Jordan Belfort. I had to make it harder as we went on.
Honestly, I saw the movie once. I didn't care for it. And I know that's a hot take. I know a lot of people think it's Leo's greatest performance, but I'm like,
I thought it was pretty good. I still can't believe you didn't get Jesus Christ.
Well, anyway, I don't mind. So before we go on, normally this is the part of the show where we talk about like, hey, what are we going to do next week? And we've already talked about how a couple of weeks back we did our movie draft, and we're going to, we picked our categories, and we're going to do all the years from the 1980s and all that good stuff. And we're definitely going to do that.
Good.
But I'm going to pull an audible on you.
Oh, sure.
And we're not going to do that next week.
Okay.
We've done all this homework about movies based on real life.
Okay.
And a movie jumped out at me when I was looking up titles earlier, because I thought, you know what, we've been spending a lot of time in the 80s. I wanted to take us away from the 80s for just 1 week. And
no, I don't want to come out of the 80s.
We'll come back and we'll revisit a year from the 80s, and we'll put you right back into your comfort zone. But I don't think it's necessarily fair to some of our listeners who maybe weren't alive in the 80s or don't agree with you that the 80s was the greatest decade ever for pop culture.
Agree with me? What?
So I wanted to just, temporarily do a little palate cleanser, go with something a little newer.
All right.
I mean, a little newer. It's still 20 years old, but I wanted next week come back.
I got that last week. By the way, I think it was Luke Martin sent me a tweet, and he was like, "I loved how you mentioned it. Okay, we're going to do something newer. This one is from 2003."
Yeah. So this one's from 2002. And this is a little movie by a director you may have heard of before called Steven Spielberg. And the movie's called Catch Me If You Can. And it stars the aforementioned Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. It's based on the real life story of Frank Abagnale Jr., who is a con man. And Tom Hanks is the federal agent trying to catch him because he's so good at being a con man. So that's what I want to watch next week. We're going to do Catch Me If You Can, the Steven Spielberg film from 2002. Give it a watch. I don't know have you ever seen it before?
I've never seen it. No.
Okay, well, that's even better.
Perfect.
So I'm hoping that it is available on the streaming services. I mean, I know I have a copy on my DVD shelf, but this is a pretty popular movie. I'm hoping you won't have any problems finding it. I think it's great. I haven't seen it in a while. I I was inspired this week when we were doing movies based on true events, and when this one came up on the list, it just popped, and I'm like, we are doing this one next. So
all right.
I'm sorry to change it up on you here,
That's
sort
okay.
of without a lot of advance warning, but you know, we're gonna do this one next week, and then at the end of next week, we'll pick a year from the 1980s to do our draft. I promise.
Okay, so we'll do our draft in 2 weeks, so that's fine. So we'll do Catch Me If You Can next week. So I'll find a way to watch it. I think it is available streaming. I don't know why.
Yeah, I'd be kind of surprised if it's not.
It's pretty popular, right? So okay, so we'll watch Catch Me If You Can. We'll come back next week and we'll review that movie. It took place after 1989, so I'll probably hate it, but you know, who knows? We'll have to wait and see. But until next week, this is Chris McBrien for Derek Myers saying thanks for listening to Pop Goes Your World, the pop culture podcast for the generations.
Thanks for listening to Pop Goes Your World. You can contact Chris and Derek at popgoesyourworld.com. Please take a minute and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you download and listen to the show.